My name is Roxanne Daly. I am 29 years old, and I have spent the last 7 years running the Dalton, my father's boutique hotel, from the inside out, while he kept his name on the deed and took the credit for every award we won. I was standing in the middle of my own office on the night of the hotel's 25th anniversary gala, the party I had spent 4 months planning down to the last candle, when 2 security guards I had personally hired walked in and asked me to hand over my key card. I laughed at first, because it had to be a mistake, because I had signed their paychecks that very morning, because I was wearing the navy silk dress I'd bought specifically for tonight, and my long blonde hair was still pinned the way the stylist downstairs had done it 2 hours earlier for the photographs. Then I looked past them through the open door and saw my father standing at the podium in the ballroom below, champagne glass raised, mid-toast, and I understood that this wasn't a mistake at all. This was timed. "Mr. Daly's orders, Miss Daly," the taller guard said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You're not on the current ownership registry. We need you to leave the building." Not on the current ownership registry. 7 years of 18-hour days. 7 years of covering for a man who had built half his fortune on numbers I had personally rearranged to keep the hotel's doors open, and I wasn't on a registry. I want to tell you, I demanded answers right there, that I made a scene worthy of everything my father had just done to me. I didn't. I picked up my clutch, smoothed the front of my dress, and walked out through the service corridor instead of the ballroom, because some instinct older than my anger told me that whatever was happening tonight, I needed to understand its full shape before I let anyone see me break. I stood in the parking garage under a flickering fluorescent light, engine running, heater blasting, and finally let myself shake. To understand how I ended up locked out of a building I had rebuilt with my own hands, you have to understand who my father actually was, not who he pretended to be in front of investors and reporters. Harold Daly opened the Dalton 25 years ago with money he inherited from his own father. A modest inheritance he stretched into a 12-room boutique property in the historic district, the kind of place travel writers loved because it felt personal, curated, cared for. What none of those writers ever knew was that the person doing most of the curating and most of the caring from the time I was 22 years old was me. My mother died when I was 20, a fast and brutal cancer that took 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. She left behind a modest trust fund in my name, money her own parents had set aside for her, meant to pay for my future, a house someday, a business of my own. My father was named trustee until I turned 25, a standard arrangement that felt harmless at the time. I didn't think much about it. I was grieving, and he was the only parent I had left, and he told me, gently, that he'd take care of everything until I was old enough to manage it myself. I started working at the Dalton the summer after her funeral, first as a favor, helping with front desk shifts while he searched for a permanent manager. The permanent manager never came. Instead, over the following 2 years, I absorbed the job piece by piece: vendor negotiations, staff scheduling, guest relations, marketing, until by the time I was 23, I was effectively running the entire property while my father spent his afternoons at the country club telling people about his hotel. He never once suggested I should have equity. Every time I brought it up gently, carefully, the way you approach a subject with someone who has a temper you've learned to navigate around, he told me the same thing. "Not yet, Roxanne. You haven't earned that yet." As if 7 years of unpaid overtime, missed birthdays, and canceled vacations were simply a long apprenticeship with no defined end date. When I turned 25, the trust fund was supposed to transfer into my control. It didn't. My father told me the market had been rough, that the fund had taken losses, that there wasn't much left to transfer, and handed me a single printed statement showing a balance so small it barely covered a used car. I remember staring at that number and feeling something crack quietly inside me, not loud enough to notice at the time, just a hairline fracture I wouldn't fully understand until years later. I didn't have the resources to challenge him. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't have proof of anything beyond a bad feeling. And I had built my entire adult identity around being the daughter who didn't cause trouble, who kept the family business running smoothly no matter what it cost her personally. So I let it go. I told myself the hotel was mine in every way that mattered except the paperwork. And someday, the paperwork would catch up to reality. That was the lie I told myself for 4 more years, right up until the night everything came apart. Victoria entered our lives when I was 26. My father hired her as a financial consultant, brought in officially to help modernize our bookkeeping systems, though I later understood her actual job was something closer to helping him hide things more effectively than he'd been hiding them alone. She was 34 then, sharp, elegant, disarmingly warm in a way that made you forget to ask hard questions. For the first year, she and I got along well. She seemed genuinely impressed by how much I'd built, told me more than once that I deserved formal recognition for it, that she'd talked to my father about restructuring the ownership to reflect my actual role. I believed her. I let myself hope, for the first time in years, that someone in a position to change things actually saw me clearly. 18 months after she started, my father announced their engagement over a family dinner I hadn't been warned about in advance. I sat there with a fork halfway to my mouth, trying to arrange my face into something that looked like happiness for him, while a colder part of my brain quietly began cataloging every conversation Victoria and I had ever had, replaying them for signs I might have missed. They married 8 months later in a small ceremony at the hotel itself. In the courtyard I had personally redesigned 2 summers earlier, planting the climbing roses along the trellis with my own hands during a rare free weekend. I stood beside my father as his only family in attendance, in a pale blue dress Victoria had picked out for me, smiling for photographs that would later hang in the lobby, a lobby I ran in a hotel I did not legally own 1 square foot of. The financial irregularities I'd been quietly managing for years didn't stop after the wedding. If anything, they multiplied. My father had always run a portion of the hotel's cash through invoices from vendors that didn't fully exist, small landscaping companies, minor maintenance contractors, entities that existed mostly on paper, skimming money off the top before it ever reached the official books. He told me, the first time he asked me to process one of these invoices, that it was temporary, a short-term solution to a cash flow problem after a bad renovation season. Temporary turned into a permanent system I processed for the better part of 5 years, telling myself each time that I was protecting the business, protecting the jobs of 40 employees who depended on that paycheck, protecting my father from consequences he genuinely didn't seem capable of imagining for himself. I want to be honest about something, because this story only makes sense if I am. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew, somewhere underneath the loyalty and the exhaustion and the desperate need to believe my father valued me, that covering for financial fraud made me complicit in it, not just an innocent daughter caught in the crossfire. I told myself I was protecting people. Some nights, staring at ledgers that didn't add up, I understood I was really just protecting the fragile idea that my father might someday tell me I'd done enough to deserve something in return. He never did. The invoices grew more aggressive after Victoria arrived, more sophisticated too, restructured in ways that suggested professional guidance rather than a man improvising alone. I noticed the shift but told myself it was simply Victoria helping modernize a system I'd already been running for years. I didn't yet understand that modernizing it meant something closer to insulating it, and insulating my father specifically, not the business, and definitely not me. The morning after the anniversary gala, I sat in my apartment with the navy dress still crumpled on my bedroom floor, 3 missed calls from my father I had no intention of returning, and a single overwhelming question circling my mind. If I wasn't on the ownership registry, who was? I called Priya Anand, a friend from college who now worked in forensic accounting, someone I trusted enough to ask an uncomfortable favor without a long explanation. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, then told me something that made my stomach drop even further. Public property records, she reminded me gently, were exactly that, public. If ownership had actually changed hands, there would be a filing somewhere, and filings left trails. It took her 2 days to find it. The Daltons' ownership structure had been formally transferred 6 months earlier from Harold Daly as sole proprietor to a newly formed holding company called Meridian Hospitality Group, 90% owned by Victoria Daly, 10% retained by my father, filed with a business attorney's office downtown that neither of us recognized. I stared at the filing date for a long time. 6 months earlier put the transfer squarely in the middle of a stretch I remembered clearly, because it was the same period my father had told me, almost offhandedly, that Victoria was helping him simplify the corporate structure for tax purposes. I had signed several documents that spring at his request, believing them to be routine operational paperwork. I hadn't read them carefully. I trusted him. That single sentence, I trusted him, sat in my chest like a stone every time I thought about it in the weeks that followed. I needed someone who understood exactly what those documents actually authorized me to sign away. And that was how Jason Marsh walked into my life, although not in the way I expected. I found his name through an unlikely source, an old bartender at the Daltons' rooftop lounge who mentioned during a quiet shift the week after the gala that Victoria had once been engaged to a lawyer before she married my father, a man named Jason who'd apparently gotten burned badly in a business deal that had Harold Daly's name attached to it somewhere in the background. I tracked him down through his firm's website, a small practice specializing in financial fraud and business litigation, and sent an email that took me 3 drafts to get right. He agreed to meet me at a diner 2 towns over from the Dalton, a neutral place neither of us had any history with. Jason was in his early 30s, dark-haired, quietly intense in a way that made you feel like he was already 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation you were having. He listened to my entire story without interrupting once, occasionally jotting something on a napkin, and when I finished, he sat back and told me his side of it. 2 years before he ever met Victoria, Jason had been a junior partner in a boutique real estate investment firm that entered into a joint development deal with my father, a small strip of commercial property adjacent to the hotel that Harold wanted to convert into additional guest suites. Jason's firm had put up the majority of the capital. 6 months into the project, financial records went missing, a construction budget ballooned without explanation, and Jason's firm lost nearly $200,000 in what an internal investigation later concluded, quietly, without ever going to court, was deliberate embezzlement on my father's end. Jason had been the one pushing to pursue legal action. His senior partners, worried about reputational damage and the cost of litigation, overruled him and let it go. He met Victoria a year later, before she ever worked for my father, both of them still building their careers in the same small professional circle. They dated for almost 2 years. He told me, with a controlled kind of bitterness, that she'd broken off their engagement abruptly, right around the time she started consulting for a hotel client she described only vaguely, and that he hadn't understood the connection until years later, when a mutual acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, that Victoria had married a hotel owner named Daly. "I should have put it together sooner," he said. I think some part of me didn't want to. Sitting across from him in that diner booth, I understood we weren't just 2 people who'd been wronged by the same family. We were 2 people who'd both spent years convincing ourselves the people closest to us couldn't possibly be capable of what the evidence clearly showed. Jason didn't waste time on sympathy. He asked for everything I had, every invoice, every signature, every filing date. And within a week, he'd built a rough map of exactly how deep the fraud actually ran. It was worse than either of us expected. The shell vendor invoices I'd been processing for years, the ones I'd rationalized as a temporary cash flow fix, had moved an estimated $1.4 million out of the hotel's official revenue over 5 years, money that should have appeared on tax filings and never did. My mother's trust fund, the one my father claimed had lost most of its value in a bad market, had actually been drained almost entirely into funding the hotel's expansion a decade earlier, disguised in the trust's records as a series of family loans that were never repaid and never intended to be. Priya found the original trust documents through a records request, cross-referenced against the hotel's early expansion financing, and the pattern was undeniable. My father hadn't lost my inheritance to bad luck. He had spent it, deliberately, on a business he then refused to give me any legal share of. And Victoria, once she married my father, hadn't dismantled the fraud. She had professionalized it, restructured the shell vendor system to be harder to trace, and then quietly moved the entire ownership structure into a holding company she controlled, positioning herself to walk away with the hotel entirely if the fraud ever surfaced, and my father needed someone to blame. "She's not protecting him," Jason said, spreading the documents across his kitchen table one evening in early spring, 3 months into our investigation. "She's protecting herself, using him as cover, the same way you were protecting him for years without ever getting anything back." I asked him what he thought we should do with what we had. He told me the honest answer wasn't a lawsuit, not first. A civil case would take years, cost more money than I had, and Victoria's lawyers would bury us in procedural delays long enough to move assets somewhere we couldn't reach. What we actually had, he said, was enough documented evidence of tax fraud and embezzlement to interest federal investigators, specifically an agent he'd stayed in contact with since his own firm's case had quietly died years earlier, a woman named Detective Renfield, who worked financial crimes for the state and had a standing relationship with an FBI field office that handled exactly this kind of corporate fraud. We spent the following 6 weeks building a formal package for them: bank records, the trust documents, invoice trails, everything organized the way Renfield told us investigators actually needed to see it. Timeline first, money second, motive last. I signed a formal statement acknowledging my own role in processing the shell invoices, understanding that honesty about my own complicity was the only way any of this would hold up. And Renfield told me, not unkindly, that given the clear pattern of coercion and the fact that I'd come forward voluntarily with evidence, cooperation would matter far more than punishment in how my part of this played out. The investigation moved quietly for 2 months. Subpoenas for bank records, interviews with vendors who confirmed they'd never actually performed the landscaping and maintenance work they'd been invoiced for, forensic accountants combing through a decade of filings. My father and Victoria had no idea any of it was happening. I still worked, technically, a management consulting contract Jason helped me negotiate that kept me inside the hotel a few days a week, under the guise of a transition period, which let me keep my eyes open without raising suspicion. The second anniversary gala after my firing arrived faster than I expected. A smaller event this time, a 1-year milestone celebration Victoria had organized to formally introduce Meridian Hospitality Group to a room full of investors and local press, the kind of polished public relaunch designed to erase any memory of a daughter who'd once run the place and then quietly disappeared. I was there, in a dark green dress, officially attending as part of the outside consulting team Victoria had hired to help with the transition. A detail that still makes me laugh when I think about how confidently she walked me back into that building without a second thought. Jason was there too, listed as a legal advisor on the event's guest roster, a fact Victoria hadn't questioned because she still believed him to be nothing more than an old, forgettable relationship from years earlier. At exactly 8:40, in the middle of Victoria's toast to Meridian's bright future, the ballroom's side doors opened, and 4 plainclothes agents walked in alongside 2 uniformed officers, Detective Renfield at the front of them, moving through the crowd with the calm, unhurried authority of someone who had done this exact walk many times before. The room went quiet in stages, first the people nearest the doors, then a ripple outward until even the string quartet stopped mid-measure. My father's face, mid-laugh at something a guest beside him had said, drained of color the moment he saw the badges. "Harold Daly," Renfield said, her voice carrying clean and flat across the sudden silence. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of tax fraud, embezzlement, and financial exploitation of a dependent." Victoria's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble floor. She turned toward my father first, not toward the officers, a look on her face that wasn't confusion so much as recalculation, the exact expression of someone realizing in real time that the story she'd spent years constructing had just collided with a version of events she hadn't accounted for. "Victoria Daly," Renfield continued, turning toward her without pause. "We also have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering." The two officers moved forward, and for one suspended second, nobody in that ballroom breathed. Then my father lunged, not toward the officers, but toward me, across 3 feet of open marble floor, his face twisted into something I had genuinely never seen on him before. Pure animal panic stripped of every carefully maintained appearance he'd spent his whole life performing. "You did this," he said, his voice cracking, guests flinching backward around us. "After everything I gave you." I stood my ground, close enough now to smell the same cologne he'd worn my entire childhood, and I felt something inside me finally, completely settle. "You gave me nothing," I told him. "I built this hotel with my own hands, while you spent my mother's money on a business you never once put my name on. You didn't lose that fund to a bad market. You spent it on marble floors and chandeliers and told me I hadn't earned enough to deserve a signature line." One of the officers stepped between us before he could close the remaining distance, guiding him back with a firm hand on his shoulder, while another moved to secure his wrists. He didn't struggle, not really, the fight seeming to drain out of him the moment the handcuffs clicked shut, replaced by something smaller and more hollow, a man finally seeing, in a room full of people who'd once respected him, exactly how far the appearance had always outpaced the reality underneath it. Victoria didn't lunge at anyone. She simply stood very still while they read her rights, her eyes finding Jason across the room, something flickering there that might have been recognition, might have been an apology that would never actually arrive. "You," she said quietly, just loud enough for those of us closest to hear. "I should have known you'd never let this go." Jason didn't answer her. He didn't need to. He crossed the room instead and stood beside me as they were led out through the same lobby I had personally designed the lighting for, guests parting silently on either side, phones raised, the whole scene destined to appear in local news within the hour and industry trade publications by the following week. I did not feel triumphant watching them go, not exactly. What I felt was closer to the specific exhaustion of finally setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten what my shoulders felt like without it. The months that followed moved with a strange, bureaucratic slowness after the sharp drama of that single night. My father pled guilty eventually, avoiding a lengthy trial in exchange for a reduced but still substantial sentence, 4 years in a federal facility for tax fraud and embezzlement, along with a court-ordered restitution plan that would take most of what remained of his personal assets. Victoria's case took longer to resolve, her attorneys fighting harder, but the money laundering charges held, supported by the shell company paper trail Priya had helped assemble, and she accepted a plea agreement that kept her out of the ballroom scene's federal spotlight, but not out of a prison sentence of her own, 18 months, along with a permanent ban from serving as an officer of any registered business in the state. The hotel itself became a civil matter that moved faster than Jason had originally warned me it might, largely because the criminal convictions made the underlying fraud undeniable in a way that simplified everything downstream. The court recognized my documented years of unpaid labor, my direct financial contributions during 2 lean years when I'd used my own modest savings to cover payroll gaps my father refused to acknowledge existed, and the improperly diverted trust fund that had financed the hotel's original expansion. What emerged from months of legal proceedings was a controlling ownership stake in the Dalton, not the full 100% I might have once fantasized about in angrier moments, but close enough, 78%, with the remainder held in a court-managed trust pending final resolution of restitution to my mother's original estate. I walked back into the Dalton's lobby for the first time as its legal majority owner on a bright Tuesday morning in early autumn, the same marble floor, the same chandelier, the same climbing roses outside the courtyard window, except this time every part of it actually belonged to me, on paper, in a way no one could quietly rearrange behind my back ever again. Jason and I didn't rush into anything in the aftermath, both of us too aware of how easily 2 people who'd been burned by the same family might mistake shared vindication for something deeper than it actually was. but he stayed close through the whole slow unraveling. Showing up for depositions he didn't technically need to attend, sitting with me in courthouse hallways during hearings that ran hours longer than scheduled, and somewhere in the accumulation of all those small, steady presences, I found myself looking forward to seeing him in a way that had nothing to do with fraud investigations at all. 6 months after the ballroom arrest, he left his firm to formally join me as a full partner in the Daltons' ownership group, handling the legal and financial oversight I never wanted to navigate blind again. And what started as a professional alliance built out of mutual betrayal, slowly, carefully, became something neither of us rushed to name out loud, though we both understood exactly what it was becoming. I think about that night often, standing in my own office while security asked for my key card, my carefully pinned hair, the navy dress I'd never wear again because I could never look at it without remembering that particular humiliation. At the time, it felt like the end of everything I'd spent 7 years building. I understand now it was actually the only thing that could have finally forced me to stop protecting people who had never once protected me back. The Dalton still runs the way it always ran, quietly excellent, personally curated, the kind of place travel writers love because it feels cared for. The difference now is that every signature on every document finally has my name attached to it, my actual name, not borrowed authority I performed for years while someone else's name sat on the deed. I kept the roses in the courtyard. I couldn't bring myself to tear them out, even knowing whose wedding they'd once framed, because I'd planted them myself, with my own hands, during one of the only free weekends I'd had in years. And some things you build stay worth keeping even after everything around them turns out to have been a lie. They're mine now, in every sense of the word, the same way this hotel finally is, the same way my own name, said out loud in rooms where it matters, finally is too.
Thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.